Morning, Mark. Good morning, everyone. How's it going? So, before we dive in, I should probably let you know that Pastor Brian is off for the next 3 weeks. And as most of you guys know, we've been going through the Sermon on the Mount since the start of the summer. And I'm convinced, absolutely convinced, that Pastor Brian planned this vacation very strategically. Because over the next 3 weeks, I get the privilege of preaching on anger and murder, then lust and adultery, and then divorce. All right, so what a gift he has left me. But to start off today, I'm just going to nerd out for a moment. Some of you guys know this. I'm a big sci-fi fantasy fan. And I'm a huge Star Wars fan. Maybe some of you guys are too. And I want us to think about Anakin Skywalker's journey to becoming Darth Vader this morning, because it's one of the most famous downfalls in cinematic history. So to remind all of us, Anakin Skywalker, he begins as this young, gifted, passionate Jedi. He's full of potential. He's part of the good guys. But slowly, anger begins to take root in his heart. First, he becomes frustrated with the Jedi Council because they don't recognize his greatness. Then he becomes frustrated with Obi-Wan Kenobi, who's his mentor. He thinks his mentor is holding him back. And then finally, fear and rage over the thought of losing his wife consume him. And scene by scene, we watch his anger metastasize. It starts small, but it festers, it grows, until finally, Anakin Skywalker turns his back on everything he once stood for. He chooses anger over peace, evil over good, and destruction over life. And in that moment, as we all know, Anakin Skywalker dies, and then Darth Vader is born. And there's this line from Yoda in Episode 1, one of the wisest Jedi Masters. And don't worry, I'm not going to do the voice. I thought about it. I'm not going to do it. But that sums up everything I just talked about, the downfall of Anakin Skywalker to becoming Darth Vader. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. But there's this thing that we all know. We don't need to look at Star Wars to see the power that fear, anger, and contempt have, do we? We don't need to go to Star Wars. If we're honest, we live in an age of outrage, just like what Marty was talking about in the beginning. You guys know this. Scroll your feed, turn on the news, just sit at a family dinner. That's all it takes. People are angry, and anger is powerful. It can mobilize, energize, and sometimes it can be righteous. I'll give you that. Sometimes you can harness anger towards good purposes. But let's be honest with ourselves. More often it's not. Anger is dangerous. We've seen this in our own relationships, like I just said. Someone says something small, but then suddenly it escalates. Harsh words, silent treatment, ghosting, distance, division we feel with those that we love. You see, this doesn't just happen out there in the world. It doesn't just happen on the internet. It happens in our homes, in our relationships, and in our community. And as we're about to discover in Matthew 5, Jesus knows exactly where unchecked anger leads. Because left untreated, irritation metastasizes into contempt, and contempt grows into cursing someone or wishing harm upon them. Thankfully, though, Jesus doesn't leave us there. Right after he gets done talking about this, he gives us an alternative. Instead of cultivating anger and contempt, he calls us to seek reconciliation quickly, repairing relationships before they fracture beyond repair. A transformed heart doesn't cultivate anger. It seeks peace immediately. And that's why this passage matters so much. It's here in Matthew 5, verses 21 through 26. Jesus says something radical. Anger and contempt, they aren't minor emotions. They're heart issues. And left unchecked, they corrode us from the inside out. Isn't simply about, whoa. Life in this kingdom isn't simply about avoiding murder. It's about addressing the anger and contempt that fuel murder. Because the kingdom Jesus invites us into, it isn't about managing sin from the outside. It's about renovating our hearts from the inside. And that's why you're going to hear me say this over and over and over again today. A transformed heart doesn't cultivate anger. It seeks peace immediately. So read with me together in Matthew 5. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Now, as always, before we dive directly into this passage, we need to zoom out. I feel like I should get that put on a t-shirt or something because you guys hear me say it every time I preach. All right, we need to zoom out and see where this passage fits within the overall narrative of the Sermon on the Mount. Because just before this section, Jesus makes a bold declaration. Brian preached about this 2 weeks ago. He makes a bold declaration. Jesus didn't come to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them. And that means the way Jesus interprets the law here is how we should now understand it. And that's why he's soon going to start saying over and over and over again, you have heard it said blank, but now I say to you blank. So when we look at this passage and the passages that come, we know this is how we should be interpreting the Old Testament law. The other thing I want to remind us of is that the Sermon on the Mount, it isn't about sin management or external rule following. It's not about looking good on the outside while ignoring what's happening on the inside. Brian and I have both preached about this over the last few months. The Sermon on the Mount is about a kingdom transformation, a deep inner renewal of the heart. See, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is describing the kind of person you become when you live in God's kingdom. So this truth frames everything that we've seen so far. It applies to the Beatitudes that we walked through over the summer, and it now carries right through into the rest of chapter 5. And now from verses 21 to 48, Jesus walks us through 6 radical transformations. 6 areas. It's his followers to leave behind old patterns and step into new patterns. And the very first issue he addresses, anger. And why start there? Because let's be honest. Few things fracture relationships faster. Few things block spiritual transformation and growth more. So to be clear here, this passage isn't about simply avoiding murder. It's about becoming the kind of person whose heart is no longer ruled by anger in the first place. A transformed heart doesn't cultivate anger. It seeks peace immediately. And in these verses, Jesus traces the progression of how anger can harden into contempt, and then how contempt ultimately can lead to wishing harm on another person. So let's dig in together. Jesus says, anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Now, why does he say this? I've already been talking about it, because anger, if left unchecked, is the seed of contempt. And don't worry, we're going to get to contempt in a moment. Now, to be clear here, fleeting anger isn't inherently wrong. It's a natural human emotion, a God-given signal that something isn't right. Think of it as a flag waving inside your heart saying, pay attention, something needs to be taken care of here. The danger, though, comes when we let that anger take root in our hearts and then guide our actions. And I think that's the anger Jesus is speaking about here. If we indulge this anger, if we nurture it, we let it fester, it doesn't just stay inside, it spills out, poisoning our relationships and fueling division with others. Sustained anger leads to retaliation, brokenness, resentment. And I think that's why Jesus is warning us so strongly about it. Now, I'm going to be honest with you guys. Just be real. I struggle with anger too. Yeah. Anybody else? Or am I the only one? Okay, cool. Yep, I'm the only one? Oh, awesome. No. All right. And I struggle with anger even with the people I love the most, like my wife. I'm going to be even more honest with you. On Friday, Erica did something that was really ticking me off in the moment. And I had to literally say to myself, a transformed heart does not cultivate anger. A transformed heart does not cultivate anger, all right? So when I'm preaching to myself. I'm not just preaching to you guys, all right? But to be, again, honest with you guys, we've had arguments so heated that I wouldn't wish them on anyone, and I would certainly not want any of you guys to witness it. And in those moments, it is raw anger. It's an emotional reaction to deep disagreement. In these times is indeed harmful. It is indeed sinful. It's horrible for our marriage. And I must continually repent of it. In the middle of these conflicts, my heart is beginning to dislike her, at least in a moment. And that's why it's so dangerous. That's why it's so sinful. But let me be clear. I'm not feeling content for her. I'm not feeling that she's worthless or anything like that. And again, we're going to get to that. But still, Jesus wants us to see that even at this level, mere irritation, resentment, frustration, we're on dangerous and we're on sinful ground. Because a transformed heart doesn't cultivate anger, but it releases it quickly and replaces it with love. Because anger is like a spark in dry grass. Left unchecked, it spreads quickly. And this brings us to Jesus' next warning. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, "Raka," is answerable to the court. All right, this one needs a little bit of unpacking because anybody here know off the top of their head what Raka means? Yeah, I didn't either. I had to look it up. Yeah, and I've been to seminary, and I still had to look it up, all right? Raka is an Aramaic word that roughly translates to empty-headed or good for nothing. Here's the thing, though. It's not a passing emotion like irritation. Raka is about assigning someone low value. It's contempt. So if anger says, "I'm upset with you," Raka, contempt, now says, "You don't even matter." Saying Raka communicates, "You are beneath me, you're unworthy of my respect, you're not worth listening to, you're not even worth dignity." And we don't have to look far for this, do we? No, we don't have to look far at all. Just turn on the news. Scroll through Twitter or X or Facebook about any political topic at all. People don't simply disagree about policies anymore. They're mocking, scorning, and dismissing each other. Democrats sometimes label Republicans ignorant, backwards, hateful, deplorable. Republicans sometimes label Democrats godless, stupid, un-American, scum. And you guys know this. That's the PG-13 version. There's a lot worse words that they use. That's Raka. That's contempt. Treating people as worthless and beneath you. In church, let me say this plainly. I don't care what your political affiliation is. I truly do not. But if you've been guilty of this, demeaning, dehumanizing someone else just because they disagree with you, you need to stop. You need to stop. Because contempt kills community faster than anger ever could. I'm going to say that again because I think it's important for all of us to hear that today. Contempt kills community faster than anger ever could. Because when contempt takes root, reconciliation becomes almost impossible. Why? Because at that point, you've already decided the other person isn't worth the effort. But kingdom people, those of us who have been transformed from the inside out by Jesus, we see others differently. We see every person as a valued bearer of the image of God, even when we disagree, even when we've been wronged. A transformed heart doesn't cultivate contempt. It immediately seeks peace. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He goes one step even further to an even greater level of anger and contempt, and an insult that's even worse. Jesus says, anyone who says, "You fool," will be in of the fire of hell. Now, this one needs even more explanation, because when we hear the word fool today, we oftentimes think of it as a light insult about someone's intelligence, something like, that was a foolish thing you did. Many of us probably had a parent at one time or another say that to us. I know, that's my story, all right? But most biblical scholars agree that Jesus is talking about something much deeper here than just a casual jab about someone's intelligence. Because in Jesus' day, the word fool, it carried a heavy religious and moral weight that it doesn't carry in our English translation of the word. Because to call someone a fool wasn't just mocking their brains, it was condemning their soul. It was a way of saying, this person is beyond redemption, God has rejected them, and implicitly, I want them to be harmed. And because of this, I actually really prefer how the New Living Translation translates this verse. I read from the NIV. It translated this verse as, and if you curse someone, you are in the danger of the fire of hell. And I think that really more gets at the spirit of what Jesus is saying here. So I want us to notice the progression that Jesus is using. Anger reacts. Contempt dismisses, but cursing then goes a step further. Cursing writes someone off completely. And that kind of judgment might seem private, even harmless at first, but unfortunately, history paints a much darker picture. And what I mean by that is that genocide rarely begins with mass violence. It begins with words. Words that strip people of their humanity. In Nazi Germany, the Jews were called subhuman. In Rwanda, the Tutsis were called cockroaches. Once contempt takes root, it paves the way for malice, which then clears the path for destruction. Because if we refuse to see the image of God in others, we start acting and living as though it's no longer there at all. So Jesus isn't just giving us a polite lesson in etiquette here. Contempt and malice don't just poison an argument, they unravel relationships, they fracture communities, and if left unchecked, can lead to atrocities. Here's the other problem with cursing someone too. When we declare anyone hopeless, too far gone, unredeemable, we're trying to play God. That's not good. We assume the right to sit in judgment over someone else's soul. And that's why I think Jesus makes the warning so severe. Anyone who says, "You fool," or "you are cursed," will be in danger of the fire of hell. Kingdom people don't condemn or curse others, because we ourselves are living proof that no one is beyond redemption. The same grace that reached us is meant for them. We dare not withhold what God so freely gave to us. So the path from anger to contempt to cursing to destruction, it isn't always immediate. But the logic of dehumanization is exactly what Jesus is warning about in these verses. A hardened, angry heart that dismisses others as worthless will, if left unchecked, move from exclusion to violence. A transformed heart doesn't curse. It seeks peace immediately. And seeking peace, that's exactly where Jesus now takes us in verses 23 through 26. So notice how he starts off with the word therefore in verse 23. You see, this little word signals a shift. Jesus now moves us from warning to action. He has warned us about anger and contempt and cursing, and now he gives us two positive examples, two illustrations, one from the religious world and one from the courtroom, showing what it looks like to immediately seek peace with those we're in conflict with. He says, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Now we read that and we think, okay, like we don't make our gift at the altar, like what's the big deal? But that statement would have stunned Jesus' original audience because the temple altar was sacred. Offering a sacrifice was one of the holiest moments in Jewish life. Many people would travel for days, even weeks, just to reach Jerusalem for this act of worship. And yet Jesus says this: peace and reconciliation with others takes precedence over religious ritual. I'm going to say that one again too. Peace and reconciliation with others takes precedence over religious ritual. Now, to bring that closer to home, I want us to think back to about a month ago when we baptized Mark Lee over here. Yeah? Picture Mark walking down in that cold Colorado River water, ready for Brian and I to lower him under, but then suddenly Mark just says, stop. I realize that my friend has something against me. He has something against me. I need to deal with this conflict before I can be baptized. Now, not a perfect illustration, but you can feel the point. Jesus is saying our relationships with others directly impact our relationship with God. And I think that's why Jesus, quoting Hosea once, said to the Pharisees, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. In short, I think God is way more interested in our desire and in our efforts to seek reconciliation with others than he is with our readiness to perform religious rituals. Instead of cultivating anger, contempt, and division, kingdom people take the first step towards peace. Reconciliation isn't optional for us. It's central to our worship it's central to our worship of God. Jesus goes on, verse 25. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still there, together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over. Quickly before conflict escalates. You see, in the first century, being hauled into court usually meant some sort of debt or slander or some other kind of offense like that. A modern-day equivalent might be getting sued. Jesus uses the illustration that once a dispute reaches the legal system, the outcome is often beyond our control. And that's why it's so important for us to seek peace and reconciliation immediately. Now, Dallas Willard unpacks this. So I'm actually going to quote him at length. Jesus tells us to be well-disposed or kindly minded toward our adversary in the preliminary interactions that might lead up to a trial. Try, with genuine love for the adversary, to resolve the matter before it comes to trial. We might cordially meet with him or her, for example, and just ask with sincerity what we could do to help. That is the sort of thing that we'll do. If we do not approach our adversary in this way, we limit ourselves and our adversary to the human system and its laws, and we will endure the bitter fruit of it. So Jesus' warning is clear. Letting conflict simmer, it only allows it to grow. The longer we wait, the higher the walls, the harder the hearts, and the steeper the cost, relationally and communally. The kingdom way, by contrast, it moves with humility. It calls us to take the first step towards reconciliation before consequences calcify and relationships fracture. Now, to be clear, though, Jesus is using these verses as an illustration, and Willard is very clear on this as well. He's instructing us to just give in blindly to someone suing us. He's not saying that. He's also not forbidding us from using the courts. I want to be clear about that as well. But he's speaking to the idea that a transformed heart acts without hostility, and it acts without bitterness, and it acts without a relentless drive to win. It's prepared to seek peace immediately and to sacrifice personal interest for the good of another, all while maintaining a joyous confidence. And this reminds me of the infamous Hatfield-McCoy feud in the late 1800s. I'm sure you guys have at least heard the term, the Hatfields and McCoys, but what began as a dispute over a pig, of all things, escalated into decades of violence, revenge, and courtroom battles. Generations were pulled into the conflict, and both families paid a very bitter and hard price over this conflict. And that's exactly the picture Jesus warns us about. Unresolved conflict, pride, delaying reconciliation, it can bind us in prisons of our own making. What could have been settled on the road or on the way to the courtroom often becomes a chain we cannot easily break free from. So to sum these last few verses up, in a religious context, seeking reconciliation restores fellowship with God and his people. And in the courtroom context, seeking reconciliation avoids destruction before it escalates. In both, the calling is the same for us. Seek peace immediately. Seek peace immediately. Because a transformed heart doesn't cultivate anger, contempt, or cursing. It seeks peace immediately. So, church, doesn't just mean managing anger. It means becoming the kind of person who naturally responds with love. And this heart transformation comes from being a disciple of Jesus, learning to trust him deeply and live interactively with God. When we abide in Christ, we become the kind of people who seek reconciliation instinctually, not out of some sense of obligation. That's the kingdom righteousness that Jesus is talking about in the Sermon. Putting off to a friend you're frustrated with. You've been rehearsing in your head, but you haven't yet spoken aloud. Responding to the latest outrage on social media, and instead asking yourself, how can I see the image of God in this person? Maybe for you it means making the conscious choice, places or situations or websites, voices that are trying to just cultivate your anger. Because let's be honest, what you're trying to do right now. Don't put yourself there. None of us need to be there. Living isn't. It's embodied in these daily decisions to pursue peace. And here's the thing. It's exactly how our hearts go. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. And eventually, Darth Vader. Yeah. But if instead we take the first step towards peace, even in small conflicts, we choose the light side of the force, and also, incidentally, the way of Jesus. All right, yeah, that's what we should be going for, the way of Jesus here. Cycle of anger, contempt, and cursing before it spirals into destruction. So here's my challenge to you guys this week. Those voices in our society that are just trying to cultivate your anger and contempt for other people, To paraphrase the governor of Utah from a few weeks ago, off, remember, and go do some good for your neighbor. Yeah, I think I got most of his points there. Identify one relationship where peace is overdue. First step, send the message, apologize, act humble. And this may not be easy. It seeks peace immediately. Let's pray.